Look at it.
Look.
I don't know why Tora always feels the urge to do the report, but I'll relieve her of her duty. I feel slightly guilty telling people that this is midwinter. Really. Like, look at it.
Yeah.
You're living in KZN.
I do have
You're
shorts
lucky.
on.
What can you say? Shorts. It's just amazing.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Anyway, well, it's Sunday morning. If you're watching live, otherwise it might be another day, or you might be listening and not seeing us. But we're busy doing a little series on Genesis, and we've had a 2-week break, Tori.
Yes, Frans, we have.
That's a long break for us.
It's very
When's
long.
the last time, Miles, we took a 2-week break from a Sunday
Ava
event?
said to me now, you're doing live stream on a weekend. I said live streams are always on a weekend. You just forgotten after 2 weeks.
Anyway, we had just Father's Day, and we were away for a weekend, so we took a little bit of a break. But today we're back in full force, and happy to be back. This type of stuff really, really excites me. So I'm excited to share what we're busy with at the moment. And this is part 2 in a series of a couple of parts. If you're jumping into part 2 today without watching part 1, I'd suggest you just stop watching right now. Go back to part 1 and watch that. It's absolutely crucial. I'll do a very quick recap today, just for Tori's sake, basically. Just to bring us up to speed with what we discussed last time. So I won't go into any of the details of it, but just to give us a good starting. So we're talking about seeing and reading Genesis through ancient eyes, and this might seem to be quite a trivial thing, but I think that once we've worked through all of this, you'd realize, as I have done, that this is actually absolutely crucial to understand the book of Genesis, is to try and read it through the ancient eyes. Through ancient eyes. How do we do this? Well, we have to investigate the ancient context. And the mistake we normally make is to try and force this ancient book to answer our modern questions. Because some of us, including myself, and this is why this is to some degree an apology, we read Genesis, we think Genesis is written to us, and we try and we read it dogmatically. You know, we believe it was written to us, although nowhere does it say that it's written to us. It's obvious it isn't. And once you believe that Genesis is written to you and to answer your questions, you force it to do that, and you get the wrong answers. So although it's almost it's impossible to completely read this through ancient eyes, because we don't have ancient eyes, what we can do is we can at least try. And a lot of profit that comes from going exercise like that. Okay, some of the things we discussed last time, I'm just going to kind of read them off and just mention them without resisting the urge to explain too much. Genesis is a very important book to Christians. It's a very, very important book, full stop. But it's also one of the most misunderstood and controversial books of the Bible, simply just because of the burden that's upon Genesis to explain the existence of everything, you know. And if you know the contents of Genesis, you'd understand what I'm saying. It takes us from nothing, or from the beginning of everything, or the beginning of the universe, to a place of finding Joseph and the Israelites in Egypt. So it's a very important book, right? It's also a story about the genesis of the nation. I think this one thing that becomes clearer as we go through this process. We realize that this is not a story necessarily about all humanity. It's actually a story about Israel. It's their genesis, their beginning. The word Genesis means beginning or origin. That's being described, and it is written to them. It was written by them and to them, to explain where they come from, how they came into this world, what their purpose is, who they are, what they should be doing. So Genesis also then is part of the Torah, which is the first 5 books you'll find in your Bible. It's a series, call it a movie series, or whichever way you want to look at it. But it climaxes at Sinai, and more than half of this book is around Sinai, where the law, of course, is given. This is where the Israelites find out who they are in the sight of God and how they should be living. So everything that's written before Sinai reflects onto Sinai, and everything that's written after Sinai reflects back to Sinai. And so the climax of the mini-series is really the Sinai event. And we're not going to be getting to that because that's not part of Genesis. But it does help us to understand that Genesis is part of the journey to get us to Sinai. That's quite important. One of the major things that you have to get your head around is that Moses did not write the book of Genesis. Moses did not write the Torah. I'm not going through all the evidences for that type of idea today, but most scholars believe that the Torah, came together in and after the great exile of the Israelites, right? So we're talking about after 539 BC. It's quite a long time after Moses, 6, 7, 800 years, depending on when you believe Moses lived. And this is an absolutely crucial point to get your head around, because that's the milieu, that's the era, and that's the context in which the book is written. And we're going to be saying a lot about that. Last week, in the first part, we worked through some of the evidences for understanding that Moses didn't, in fact, write this book.
Okay.
So we're not going to go through all of this again. But the point is that this also then goes for Genesis. Moses did not write Genesis. Yes, it's tradition. It's a dogmatic belief, but there's no evidence for that. The books themselves are written like stories about a person called Moses, if you just read them plainly, right? So, but our tradition tells us Moses wrote them. So once you realize that, okay, if you put that aside and try and be brave enough to say, all right, well, most probably Moses didn't write these books, then the question is, when were they written, who wrote them, and so on. And so scholars indicate that they were written more or less in the 6th century. The books of the Torah, the book of Genesis, came together. It was compiled. There were various authors, but there were final redactors that brought it to the form that we have today and strung all the stories together to form a wholesome whole. In other words, none of the stories that we find in Genesis or any of the other first 5 books of the Torah, none of these stories should be read in isolation. They all climb together on the bandwagon to take us somewhere. And that's a rather important point. But I think these things will become clearer as we move on through this. Another thing that is quite important is to understand that during the exile, this type of writing and redacting of the Torah was kind of like, it played a very strong role in bringing all of this together, because suddenly the nation found themselves outside of their country in Babylonian exile, if you can recall. And more than a generation is born in Babylon, and these people might not know who they are, where they come from. And so this would have accelerated, or at least prompted, the Israelites, the elite in the Israelite camps, to start saying, okay, let's put our oral stories in writing. So nobody is saying that these stories are from the 6th century necessarily, but they were first written down here. This is the first evidence we have of them. We don't have any other written records of them, right? So the idea is just simply that in around the 6th century, we have them come together in the form we have today. This goes for the Torah, but this would also have been the case for the book of Genesis, right? Okay, so the constant Babylonian pressure could be the reason, and these are the things we're going to start investigating today. The constant Babylonian pressure during this time, they were exiled, they were living under Babylonian cultural conditions, religious conditions, might be the reason why, specifically in Genesis, we find so much anti-Babylonian rhetoric. And this is something you're not going to pick up if you're reading Genesis from a modern perspective and you want to read it through modern eyes. You're never going to pick up on the anti-Babylonian rhetoric, polemic that's in there. This you only pick up when you've done enough research to realize that some of these things were already there in the ancient world. And this was the Israelites trying to kind of distinguish themselves and set their identity separate from that which was going on in the world around them. So, in other words, to read Genesis through an ancient lens, we have to realize that these are the stories that came together in a time where the people of Israel were basically exiled or in the wake of the exile. They've just come through a huge national disaster in which it seems like all hope was absolutely lost. Some of their kids were born in Babylon. They couldn't go to a temple. They were losing their identity, and this was a way to consolidate their identity and put it in writing for future generations to obviously then be able to access it. So it was a way that they were making sense of their past. They were making sense of their current exiled or just post-exile situation, but also how to treat the future and how to move forward. And this, all of this was while there was this Babylonian pressure on them. All right. So basically, it could be understood that Genesis is a theological response to the Babylonian captivity. This at least would have been one of the major factors that would have influenced the lens through which the books were written and the lens through which the books needed to be read. So this is not just an empty statement that is made by scholars. This statement is supported by what we actually find in Genesis. And that's the journey we're going to be going on right now. But this is one of the most important things you need to at least consider at this point, putting it on the table for your consideration. If you're uncomfortable with it, put it aside until we've worked through some of these situations and stories. But it does seem like the book of Genesis comes as a kind of a reaction to what they were undergoing in Babylon. Okay, so today I would like to do a short overview of the entire book of Genesis, just for people who are completely unfamiliar with Genesis, but even if you are an avid reader of the Bible, it's very seldom that we sit with the book of Genesis and just kind of, read it from beginning to end. So I just want to frame the book of Genesis in terms of what we find in it, the content, and then we're going to start with Genesis 1. Okay, so Genesis has 50 chapters. And it takes us from Adam all the way through to Joseph. And it kind of gives us a genealogy, which you could, and people have done this. They've sat down and traced all the dates back and calculate all the ages. Some has gone as far as trying to calculate when the world was created. And some put dates down like 26 October, 4006 BC and stuff like that, because it all fits together. But that tells us that this is part of the intent of the book of Genesis, is to trace the nation of Israel all the way back to their progenitor, their very first progenitor, which in here it seems he is called Adam. Right? So it gives us a continual lineage all the way back to this man Adam, which God made. In other words, an Israelite laity that was born in Babylon could open up this book and trace his lineage, more or less, all the way back to God directly, which was incredibly important for the Israelites because they were the people of God, and this gave them an idea of identity or a security of identity. Right. Genesis, we are going to divide into two sections. The first section is Genesis 1 to 11, and then the second section is Genesis 12 to 50. Now, you would know that Genesis 12 is where Abraham appears on the scene, right? Genesis 1 to 11 is from the formation of the cosmos through to the Tower of Babel. And then we start with which seems to be more prose-like, historical writing about a man called Abraham. Okay. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who becomes Israel, who has Joseph. Joseph takes everyone into Egypt, and that's where Genesis stops, setting the stage for what? The Exodus, right? The coming out of the Israeli people. All right, so ancient writers obviously didn't have chapter numbers. They didn't use chapter numbers. This is the invention of Christian monks of the medieval age. But there is a type of format that the book of Genesis uses. And this is the use of a verse or a phrase that in Hebrew, I'm not going to try and pronounce the Hebrew, but it is often translated then into English. It's the same phrase translated into different English phrases, which means that you won't be able to recognize it as the same phrase. Okay, so it's often translated as, this is the account of, or these are the descendants of, or these are the generations of. These are all the same Hebrew phrase, and it appears 10 times in Genesis. You remember from our previous little series. And this seems to be the format that the redactors finally used, the final redactors used to create a bit of a format for
Structure.
us. Yeah, excuse me, structure is a better word for the book of Genesis then. These 10 sections you can go look up yourself, but I'm going to give you the headings. Most of these are just the lineages of very important characters, except for the very first one. The first one of the heavens and earth. The second one is the line of Adam. Then we have the line of Noah. Number 4 is Noah's sons. Number 5 is specifically Shem, the son of Noah. Number 6 is Terah, who was the father of Abraham. Number 7 is Ishmael, which is interesting that he gets his own little lineage. Number 8 is the lineage of the line of Isaac. Number 9 is the line of Esau. And then finally, the star of the show, the climax of the book of Genesis, is the man Jacob. And so the final chapter, the final divider, is the line of Jacob, who then becomes Israel. And so one of the things that seems to be quite clear is this book is a book about the genesis of Israel. It's about Israel. It's not about humanity. It's about Israel. And it brings you to Israel. The book delivers Israel on the earth, a nation now ready for God to start working with and to start bringing them, eventually into their promised land and so on. All right, so those are the 10 chapter headings. We're not going to be dealing with the book of Genesis according to those chapter headings. What we are going to be doing is we're going to be dealing with Genesis according to our chapters. Just to keep it simple, you know where we are and it's easier to follow. So that we're going to be doing for simplicity's sake. So the first part of Genesis, and we're just doing a very brief overview, Genesis 1 to 11, takes us from the formation of the cosmos, the formation of Adam and Eve, and out of them comes Cain, and you can follow the whole line. Eventually brings you to Noah, the flood, the sons of Noah, through which all the nations of the earth then kind of, at least that's how we see it, then come out of. And then we end off with the Tower of Babel, which we're going to be discussing. And just off the bat, Babylon, hello, something's going on here. Why is Babylon mentioned in this way? It should trigger some ideas of why not another name? Why not the Assyrians? Why not the Persians? Why not the Greeks? The Babel is specifically used. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's the first part. Then the second part, starting in chapter 12, we have the story, basically, chapter 12 to 50, is the story of Abraham all the way into Egypt eventually. And it tells a story of, Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, or I think he's called the Chaldean, which is basically Babylon. And it is important to understand that according to the Bible, Abraham comes out of Babylon to become something beautiful in a promised land. Just keep that in mind. It's because this is also the story of Israel themselves. They come out of Babylon back into their promised land. That's the context in which these stories are finally redacted. Okay, so a short summary of the second section. Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, which later would be Babylon. He's a pagan, of course. He lives in faith. He travels to the promised land with his wife, Sarah. His promise then is for a land and a nation. These are the two things God promises to Abraham, that he'll be a massive nation, become the nation Israel, but that they will inhabit a land. These are the two things that are promised to Abraham and his offspring. The story is filled with obstacles. There are lessons, there are tests, small victories, and also many mistakes. One of these is, for instance, his son Isaac, that comes because of God's promise. And his son Jacob, who encounters Abraham's God, he wrestles with him, and then finally he is given the name Israel. Through one of Jacob's sons, then Joseph, Jacob and his whole family ends up in Israel. Ends up in Egypt. At first, they are special guests, they get the best of the place, but eventually, Genesis leaves us here where they multiply too quickly, which is part of the promise that they would. but then they are treated as slaves and they end up at the bottom of the food chain. And that's kind of where Genesis then leaves us. What becomes clear is that Genesis is a story about Israel and them as the beneficiary of land and a nation through the promise that was given to Abraham. There is then in the story, there's a continuous struggle with God, right? In pursuit of the promise and the land. There's it's an overarching theme to Genesis. It is seen in Adam and Eve's struggle, for instance, that they can't stay in their Eden. They struggle with disobedience. They end outside, and now they have to struggle with the land and with childbirth. This is what we obviously see from the stories. Then you have their sons that struggle all the way. You have Cain that struggles to get approval. You get Abel gets murdered, and God eventually gives them another son. Is he Shem or Seth? Sorry, I think it's Seth. Um, anyway, later on, Noah struggles. Noah has to build an ark to survive the terrible wickedness that's upon the earth. His sons struggle with each other. The one is better than the rest, and the others have to serve him. Abraham later on struggles. He goes to Egypt because there's a famine in the promised land, and he has to lie about his wife, and eventually comes back out. And finally, in the person Jacob, who struggles from the moment he is born with his brother, later on with Laban. Finally, Jacob has to struggle with, in the story, it seems to be suggested he's struggling with God himself. When he's fighting that being that comes to him, and he's left with a mark on his, like a bit of a wobble. What's the right English word? A limp. And then is named Israel. And one of the meanings of Israel, the simple meaning, is one who struggles with God. So personified in Jacob, or in Israel, if you like, is the idea that they always struggling with God. This simple overview makes one important thing quite clear. Genesis is written by a later people, and they themselves are struggling. They struggling in Babylonian exile. They've been exiled like Adam, and they are struggling to get back into their land, struggling to find their identity. And they are writing this struggle with God back into their stories so that their children, the future generations, can understand the struggles, why there are struggles, and the lessons that are to be learned from the struggles. This is a story of Genesis. The story of Genesis is written and should be understood concerning how later Israelites saw themselves, how they understood their relationship, or we can say their struggle with God, their struggle with and their relationship with the surrounding peoples. How did it come that the peoples are there, and why there are sometimes animosity? There's animosity between them and the other peoples, and also to make sense of the promise of them being a nation and being a land. So this is something we have to keep in mind all this time, and as I say, unfortunately, I have to put this out there, and we'll have to build the evidence as we go. But Israel is writing this. We're talking about Genesis, is redacting, putting the older stories together in Genesis to make sense of where they are in terms of the stories that they've shaped to make sense for today. As we get for their day, excuse me, and this is often what happens. This is almost always what happens when people write, is they write their own filter into, even if it's an ancient story about the past, they have to see and write that story through their current viewpoints and context. And the writers of the book of Genesis are no different in that sense. We are no different. That's why we do this to the Bible. We take it out of context because we understand ancient stories and history through our own eyes. Okay. All right. So we try not to do that then. Okay. So Let's move on to Genesis 1. Now, me and Tori, we did a series just a while ago, and that's also available on YouTube, where you can go back and you can have a look at that. We had a look at the two creation stories found in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to 3. We laid them out, we walked through them very slowly, and we compared them. Our conclusion is the same as most of the mainline scholars that are not dogmatically orientated, that these are actually two different stories. And it becomes quite apparent when you spend time in them that they're quite different. Now, today we're going to be working through the first chapter of Genesis. Um, our angle is slightly different for Genesis this time because we are not trying to find the differences between the two stories, but we are trying to see this first chapter of Genesis. How would that relate to an Israel in Babylonian captivity? Or does it even relate? Is there any evidence that it does? Okay, so in Genesis chapter 1, we are so familiar with the stories of Genesis, and often we understand them through our particular denominational views. You know, everybody is different and see these things differently. But we actually then we miss the spectacular literature that it really is, and the function of that literature for a people that have just endured a national absolute disaster. So we're gonna try and see how that works then. All right. So the ancient stories of creation in Genesis are not accounts of how God created the universe out of nothing. And I know this is quite a controversial point, and it's important for us, and it's been very important to me for a very long time because I'm scientifically orientated, and you know, I know the argument of how the Bible always predicted that there was nothing and now there's something, and the ancient Greek default view was that everything has always been eternal. But I have to admit that after studying this properly, I realized that that's not what's going on in Genesis 1. Um, these are not, this is not an account of how God made the universe. The ancients wouldn't have understood the idea of universe at all. And they also, in as far as we know from Mesopotamian writings, they're not concerned with how things came from nothing or whether it came from nothing, but they're always concerned of how did things become orderly like we have it. So all the ancient Mesopotamian creationists start with chaos and they move to cosmos. So cosmos is a Greek word that means an orderly arrangement. And the Jewish version of these early formation stories, it's no different. It is a story about how God created the beautiful order out of the cosmos, the beautiful order out of the chaos that was there. Another way to read Genesis 1:1 is like this, and most scholars believe this is the right way to read it. In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was chaotic, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. The point is simply that the first verse of Genesis 1, verse 1, is not God created this. It's when he began to form, when he began to put things in order. The earth was chaotic and void, and waters covered the deep, and his spirit was hovering upon it. Okay, all right. So we do not really start with nothing in Genesis 1:1, but we actually start with chaos here in the very beginning. We have to suspend our 21st century view of the universe when we approach these writings, right? And the reason why we need to do that is because we have other writings from this time which look the same. And so we can't no longer put the biblical account, the biblical creation account, in a little box and say it was completely isolated from its surroundings or from the stories of the surrounding peoples, or in this case, from the very important oppressing Babylonians. We can't do that anymore. We have to read the biblical accounts next to them. And what we learn from that, yes, they are different, and we're going to be talking about how they are different. but they are not accounts of how the universe started, how matter started. They're accounts of chaos being turned into cosmos. Okay, right. These creation stories in the ancient world, they don't start with nothing and then nothingness get turned into something. The ancient storytellers don't seem to be interested in how the universe got here, at least not in a modern scientific sense. They weren't thinking of a universe at all, but they were thinking of cosmos, the order. Everybody is witness to the order we have in this place we live. They were interested in how the order came. Right. So the order and arrangement of the world they could see and experience. That was what they were interested in. So Genesis does not answer the question on where the earth and the deep come from, but it tells us what God did with a dark and void earth and deep, right? What it does tell us is that God is turning chaos, the formless void, into beautiful order. In other ancient creation stories, the gods did not create out of nothing, but the gods tamed the chaos, often depicted as other gods or monsters or dragons. The Genesis creation account then is Israel's version of who really did all of this. And so here is where we start seeing that there is an element of reactionary writing um, coming from Babylon, being under those stories for so long, for a period, a generation or two. They had to write a version in which Yahweh is actually the one who ordered him, not Marduk and his Travante, not them, not the Babylonian gods, our God, and of course the Lord God, or Yahweh as it was at the Tetragrammaton. All right, so Genesis does not answer. Okay, said all of that. Um, so then the Genesis creation account then is Israel's version of who really is responsible for taming and ordering the chaos. So what sets the Israelite version apart from its peers is that God works alone. This is one of the things that's different. They're not multiplicity of gods. At least they're not mentioned, not by name. God doesn't fight with anyone. There's no divine violence that's taking place. God is working. He's working on his own, and he swiftly overcomes the chaos by words only. This is huge. This is very different to the other accounts. The words of his mouth. He doesn't have to fight any other gods, and doesn't have to do any violence for this to happen. So in the Genesis account, God does this forming of order, the formation of order, or the creation of order of the cosmos. In the first 3 days, he separates and creates space. And in the second portion, the 4 to 6, day 4 to 6, second half, he fills those spaces with living things. The whole chapter really is written to answer the question of verse 1, everything is chaos. And so the rest of the chapter goes to order all of this chaos. All right. Now, chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, is not a scientific explanation of how the universe was created from nothing. We know that if you try and map this onto science, it doesn't work. That's not what it was doing. They didn't have an understanding of modern science. They didn't understand relativity or how macroevolution or cosmic evolution takes place. They didn't have any of those notions. This is not what this chapter is talking about at all. It's also not an allegory for evolution, right? So there's three basic ways in which to read and understand the book of Genesis. You can read it like a literalist by believing that everything is 100% scientifically true, right? Then you can read it as an allegorist, if there's a word like that. In that sense, you mean that everything is allegory for real science. And I believe that both these ways are actually wrong because it neglects the context and people we are dealing with.
And the intention.
And the intention of these people. So when we read the other ancient creation accounts, we start realizing that neither of those two options are a viable option for what Genesis really is. Genesis is more a different version of those ancient stories that puts their God as the tamer of chaos, the one responsible for all the beauty and the order that's in the world. Now, I've been a believer in all three of these views as I've traveled during my my relationship with the Bible. Um, but here I've found myself at the moment understanding that in its context, it's ancient people writing with ancient understanding, but trying to say something new. It seems to me to be the most logical approach. The other approaches are highly dogmatic, and the evidence is not really there to bear them or hold them up. And once you put them under scrutiny, they really do fall flat.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens in chapter 1 of Genesis? Well, in day 1, I'm just going to read this very quickly. I'm not going to stand still at any of this. On day 1, God creates space for the sun, moon, and stars. He does this by separating light from darkness. Right. So in day 4, then he fills the separation with the sun, moon, and the stars. Day 1 and 4. I'm jumping across. Day 2, God creates space for the birds and the sea creatures. He does this by separating the waters below from the waters above, done with what's called the firmament, like a dome-shaped hard thing that keeps water above. Yeah, we spoke about that in the previous series. He then, on day 5, he fills the created space, or this new order, with sea creatures and birds.
Mm-hmm.
On day 3, God moves the oceans to the side. He separates land from the oceans. Dry land forms. And then finally, in day 6, the culmination of all of this is in day 6, he fills this new land space with all the animals, the land animals. And finally, in Genesis 1, the crown of the creation is kind of like these humans, and they are given dominion and so on. So if you read it from this perspective, it's a separation and filling, separation and filling. It's creating order out of the chaos. And on day 7, God looks at it and he goes, this is great. Like, this is really good. I love what I've done. He goes into rest. Right. That's basically chapter 1. By the end of the chapter, chaos has been ordered, but it's also been filled with life, elements of life. The cosmos has replaced the chaos, and all of this has happened in 6 days and by speaking only. All right. So, now if Genesis was shaped, as we've stated previously, partly at least as a reaction to Babylonian experience, right? We would not be surprised to find some Babylonian ideas nested here and there inside the account. Nobody is saying that they copied the Babylonian accounts. But what scholars are saying that it is obvious to them that they are undergirding ideas that are similar in the Babylonian accounts, which are way older than the Jewish accounts. And this shows us, number one, more or less at what time these things were then, I guess, written or brought together, um, and that they are, in some sense, could be in reaction. And the reason for saying that they could be in reaction to Babylon is specifically because the Jews found themselves under Babylonian oppression, exiled, their land destroyed, their temple destroyed, taken away into a foreign land, foreign gods, foreign culture, foreign everything. If you think of the book of Daniel, tries to explain what it was like for young Jewish princes, I guess, or the elite. Constant pressure of having your name changed, eating wrong foods, breaking kosher laws. That type of pressure was definitely there for him. Okay, so the question then is, do we find some things that were similar in the Jewish account to the Babylonian creation account? And the answer is yes. I'm going to just mention 4 of these things quickly. I don't want to rush them because they are very important. So I'll go slowly through them. Firstly, the Babylonians were big on astrology. They're known for that. They used the sun, moon, the stars to predict the future. Right? They were experts in this. They were skilled enough to read. They were not only astrologers, but they were also astrologists. Is that the two? Yeah, I think so.
You just said the same word.
Did I say astronomy and astrology were the two things?
Astronomers and astrologers.
Did I say that? All right, anyway, well, fine. But for the Israelites, when they write, the sun, moon, and stars are not there to predict the future at all. but they are there simply to show the seasons, the days, and the year. So they mark off time to
Yeah.
some degree. They are passive agents. They are not gods. They don't have any divine inspired like being in them. They're just passive agents, and all they do is they keep time. Some scholars go as far as suggesting that because the word for seasons that's used in Genesis 1 is the same as the word used for the appointed time of the feasts later on, it could be, the case could be made that they were actually writing this implying that sun, moon, and stars are there to tell Israel when to have their feasts. In other words, the Jewish writers cut the sun, moon, and stars down to size as not active agent predicting future divine in some way, but literally passive agents that tell Israel when to worship God in a proper way. That's the first one of the comparisons that is made. In the Babylonian creation account, which is the Enuma Elish, sorry I didn't mention that, that is there is a clash of gods in the very beginning in order for order to come forth. But this is not so in Genesis. In Genesis, God works on his own by the words of his mouth. There's absolutely no violence. But in the Enuma Elish, the god Marduk has to slaughter his grandmother Tiamat, right? He fillets her from top to bottom, and then he then uses her bottom half of her body. He uses it to make a barrier which separates the water. This is the equivalent of the Genesis firmament. Same idea, but the one is mythic, in like there's a god that has to be slayed and then the body.
Yeah.
But in the Genesis account, God just creates a firmament. Boom. No gods, no slaying, no violence. But the point is, same cosmological idea that there's water above this dome and water below this dome, and the gods, God made the space like that. So that's how we know that this is somehow knows about the Babylonian account in some way. Okay, number 3, comparison between Genesis account and the Enuma Elish. In the Babylonian account, this grandmother, which I've mentioned, Marduk's grandmother, her name is Tiamat, and she represents the sea goddess. Often she's also represented as a monster, sea monster of some kind. And she has to be slain, then there's order. That's the kind of depiction that we have. But in Genesis, the waters, called Tahom, which is a related Semitic word to Tiamat, it's a passive agent. It's not divine at all. It's just water. And when God speaks, it just moves. And once again, we see this effortless account. But what we do notice then in general is that the Jewish account demythologizes everything. And there's this God that everything else is passive creative stuff, and he just moves it around like he wants by the word of his mouth. Where in the Babylonian accounts, the gods are literally fighting with other gods to make order. So this is one of the different things that we find in the Jewish account. The last one I want to mention today is that in the ancient world, kings were often seen as the representatives of the gods, particular gods sometimes made in their image to represent them and govern. So the idea that in the Jewish account, all humans are in the image of God that seems to be quite revolutionary. And that, for instance, in the account of, I think it's called Artaxerxes, the epic of Artaxerxes, humans are made as an afterthought to do the dirty work that the gods don't want to do. In Genesis 1, humans are special. They are the image of God, and they are there to take control, look after things on behalf of God as an image and likeness. The word image means as a representative. So those are 4 ways in which these things are rather similar, but also different. But what is obvious to scholars is that there's a relationship between the Babylonian accounts and the Jewish account, although they look different. The best way I always explain this is if you had a Volkswagen and a Ferrari next to each other, I can point out hundreds of differences, but in the end, they're both cars. And that's kind of what's going on here. This leads us to the conclusion that Genesis 1 is actually a statement of faith. It's a theological piece. That the God of Israel alone is worthy of worship because he is the one who brought order out of the chaos. Not the Babylonian gods, or the gods of any other nation. He alone is responsible for bringing this order to being. In other words, Genesis 1 was not written to answer our modern questions concerning the historical or the scientific accuracy of how the universe happened,
Yep.
nor of how the ancient Israelites wrote in allegorical, poetic form to prove the Big Bang and an expanding universe. That's not what's going on. No, it was written to tell the Israelites that their God, and not the God of the other nations, was the Chaos Tamer. And therefore, this God and He alone was worthy of worship. And they made this theological point in ancient terms, using ancient ways of thinking. I think this is the most important statement from Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is a theological statement that God alone, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the only chaos. But they made this theological point in ancient terms, using ancient ways of thinking. They didn't use modern science. They did not have insight into modern science. They did not understand new ideas like evolution, etc., the Big Bang. They did not have an insight into that. Take that off their shoulders. They used what they have to say the God of Israel is the only God. Right. Okay. So later in the Exodus story, we will see them not only depict God then, as we've seen now, as creator, but also as the deliverer, the great creator and the great deliverer. That comes a little bit later. So I end off by saying, expecting Genesis 1 to be a historically and scientifically accurate explanation of the creation of the universe, because it is part of the Bible, right? That, or rejecting it as, oh, it's just stories people told, it's worthless. Both of these ideas sell the Bible short of what it really is, and we misunderstand the function of these accounts. So what happens normally with when people hear this for the first time, hopefully they don't just take it, they go and research it for themselves. And there's normally one of two reactions. The one reaction is, no, we reject all the context. We read it as we read it dogmatically through our denominational doctrine. That's how we're going to be doing it. We close our eyes to what really happened back there. That's the one reaction. The other reaction is, oh, the Bible's nonsense. Now, both of these are extreme reactions, and both of them leave out the real value of what's going on, the real function that these accounts were used for. And that's the function that we've explained, theological point. In the face of Babylonians that were basically the world power at that time, they were standing up and they were sticking it to the man, something like that, and standing up bravely and saying, no, this, our God, is the only God. He is responsible. They were theological storytellers. They were not historians, and they were not scientists. Theological storytellers produced the book of Genesis. That's the most important thing, I guess, I can say today. But that brings us to the end of the first chapter of the book of Genesis. The God of Israel is better than all other gods. He is the only one responsible. He is the one who brought Israel into being, and he's the one that will, if we now reflect, how does that reflect onto a later Israel? This great God, the only who did all of this, he's going to bring us back. He's going to bring us back into our land. He's going to give us the promise he gave us because he is this mighty. So, Israelites, don't serve the Babylonians. Don't fall for their stuff. Our God will do this for us. We've been struggling with him all this time, but he's going to come through for us. And that's basically one of the lessons that we take from this. So that's Genesis 1. I'll leave you with that today. Next week, we're going to go to Genesis 2. And I think that this is going to be the best session, I think, probably of the whole series, because we're going to approach Genesis 2 from a completely different angle. We're not going to say, oh, is it different from Genesis 1? Although it is. We're going to say, what story, what lesson is it trying to tell? What lesson would it be telling or giving people finding themselves in an exile or in the wake of an exile
Mm.
in the 6th century.
Okay.
So we'll do that next week. Thanks so much for being with us today. Have a
Yeah.
great Sunday. Cheers.
Bye.